Karl Marx, The Class Struggles in France. The election law still needed one thing to complete it, a new press law. This was not long in coming. A proposal of the government, made many times more drastic by amendments of the Party of Order, increased the caution money, put an extra stamp on feuilleton novels, answer to the election of Agensu, taxed all publications appearing in weekly or monthly parts up to a certain number of sheets, and finally provided that every article of a journal must bear the signature of the author. The provisions concerning the caution money killed the so-called revolutionary press. The people regarded its extinction as satisfaction for the abolition of universal suffrage. However, neither the tendency nor the effect of the new law extended only to this section of the press. As long as the newspaper press was anonymous, it appeared as the organ of a numberless and nameless public opinion. It was a third power in the state. Through the signature of every article, a newspaper became a mere collection of literary contributions from more or less known individuals. Every article sank to the level of an advertisement. Hitherto, the newspapers had circulated as the paper money of public opinion. Now they were resolved into more or less bad solo bills, whose worth and circulation depended on the credit not only of the drawer, but also of the endorser. The press of the Party of Order had not only incited for the repeal of universal suffrage, but also for the most extreme measures against the bad press. However, in its sinister anonymity, even the good press was irksome to the Party of Order, and still more to its individual and provincial representatives. As for itself, it still demanded only the paid writer, with name, address, and description. In Maine, the good press bemoaned the ingratitude with which its services were rewarded. The law went through. The provision concerning the giving of names hit it hardest of all. The names of Republican journalists were pretty well known, but the respectable firms of the Journal de Débat, the Assemblée Nationale, the Constitutionnel, etc., cut a sorry figure in their high protestations of state wisdom, when the mysterious company all at once disintegrated into purchasable penny-aligners of long practice, who had defended all possible causes for cash, like Rani de Cassagnac, or into old milksops, who called themselves statesmen, like Capfic, or into coquettish fops like Mr. Lemoine of the Debat.
J.P. Nettle, Rosa Luxemburg. On the morning of 28 December 1905, immediately after the Christmas holidays, a small group of people assembled on the platform of the Friedrichstrasse station, Berlin's railway terminus to the east. The Kotskys and a few others were seeing Rosa Luxemburg off, to go to work. They loaded her with gifts, useful things like shawls and mufflers for the Russian winter, as well as good advice on how to keep warm. To a family whose physical adventurousness was confined to an annual holiday at a mountain spa, the idea of traveling to Warsaw in the midwinter of revolution was lunacy, if not masochism, even though they had to admit to a sneaking admiration for Rosa Luxemburg's extraordinary courage. Finally, with a defiant whistle blast, the train moved off, and Rosa Luxemburg, well-known German writer and intellectual, became Anna Machka, the anonymous Polish conspirator falsely decked out as a minor journalist. As the train moved eastwards into the gathering dusk, Rosa Luxemburg, in her third-class compartment, prepared joyfully for the coming experience.
Judith Butler, Undoing Gender. Criticality is thus not a position per se, not a site or a place that might be located within an already delimitable field, although one must, in an obligatory catachresis, speak of sites, of fields, of domains. One critical function is to scrutinize the action of delimitation itself. By recommending that we become critical, that we risk criticality, in thinking about how the sexual field is constituted, I do not mean to suggest that we could or should occupy an atopical elsewhere, undelimited, radically free. The questioning of taken for granted conditions becomes possible on occasion. But one cannot get there through a thought experiment, an epoch, an act of will. One gets there, as it were, through suffering the dehiscence, the breakup of the ground itself. Even within the field of intelligible sexuality, one finds that the binaries that anchor its operations permit for middle zones and hybrid formations, suggesting that the binary relation does not exhaust the field in question. Indeed, there are middle regions, hybrid regions of legitimacy and illegitimacy that have no clear names, and where nomination itself falls into a crisis produced by the variable, sometimes violent boundaries of legitimating practices that come into uneasy and sometimes conflictual contact with one another. These are not precisely places where one can choose to hang out, subject positions one might opt to occupy. These are non-places in which one finds oneself in spite of oneself. Indeed, these are non-places where recognition, including self-recognition, proves precarious, if not elusive, in spite of one's best efforts to be a subject in some recognizable sense. They are not sites of enunciation, but shifts in the topography from which a questionably audible claim emerges, the claim of the not yet subject, and the nearly recognizable.
Anne Carson, The Gender of Sound. When my father and the father of my father grew old enjoying among these citizens who wrong one another, from this I am outcast. An exile on the furthest fringes of things, like onomacles, here all alone I have set up my house in the wolf thickers. I dwell keeping my feet outside of evils, where the lesbian woman in the contest for beauty come and go with trailing robes, and all around reverberates an otherworldly echo of woman's awfully yearly shrieking, Ololigas. This is a poem of radical loneliness, which Alcaios emphasizes with an oxymoron, all alone, hoyos. I have set up my household, eoikeza, he says at verse 10. But this wording could make little sense to a 7th century BC ear. The verb eoikeza is made from the noun oikos, which denotes the whole relational complex of spaces, objects, kinsmen, servants, animals, rituals, and emotions that constitute life within a family, within a polis. A man all alone cannot constitute an oikos. Alcaios' oxymoronic condition is reinforced by the kind of creatures that surround him. Wolves and women have replaced, quote, the fathers of my fathers, end quote. The wolf is a conventional symbol of marginality in Greek poetry. The wolf is an outlaw. He lives beyond the boundary of usefully cultivated and inhabited space, marked off as the polis, in that blank no man's land called toapeiron, quote, the unbounded, end quote. Women, in the ancient view, share this territory spiritually and metaphorically in virtue of a, quote, natural, end quote, female affinity for all that is raw, formless, and in need of the civilizing hand of man. So, for example, in the document cited by Aristotle that goes by the name of the Pythagorean table of opposites, we find the attributes curving, dark, secret, evil, ever moving, not self contained, and lacking in its own boundaries aligned with female, and set over against a straight, light, honest, good, stable, self contained, and firmly bounded on the male side. Aristotle, Metaphysics. I do not imagine that these polarities or their hierarchization is news to you, now that classical historians and feminists have spent the last 10 or 15 years codifying the various arguments with which ancient Greek thinkers convinced themselves that women belong to a different race than men. But it interests me that the radical otherness of the female is experienced by Alcaios, as also by Ernest Hemingway, in the form of women's voices uttering sounds that men find bad to hear. Why is female sound bad to hear? The The sound that Alcaios hears is that of the local lesbian women who are conducting beauty contests and making the air reverberate with their yelling. These beauty contests of the lesbian woman are known to us from a notice in the Iliadic Scholia, which indicates they were an annual event performed probably in honor of Hera. Alcaios mentions the beauty contests in order to remark on their prodigious noise level and, by so doing, draws his poem into a ring composition. The poem begins with the urbane and orderly sound of a herald summoning male citizens to their rational civic business in the assembly and the council. The poem ends with an otherworldly echo of women shrieking in the wolf thickers. Moreover, the women are uttering a particular kind of shriek, the ololiga. This is a ritual shout peculiar to females. It is a high-pitched, piercing cry uttered at certain climactic moments in ritual practice, e.g., at the moment when a victim's throat is slashed in sacrifice, or at climactic moments in real life, e.g., at the birth of a child, and also a common feature of women's festivals. The ololiga, with its cognate verb ololizo, is one of a family of words, including eleles, with its cognate verb elelizo, and alala, with its cognate verb alalazo, probably of Indo-European origin and obviously of an onomatopoeic derivation. These words do not signify anything except their own sound. The sound represents a cry of either intense pleasure or intense pain. To utter such cries is a specialized female function. When Alcaios finds himself surrounded by the sound of the Oliliga, he is telling us that he is completely and genuinely out of bounds. No man would make such sound. No proper civic space would contain it unregulated. The female festivals in which such ritual cries were heard were generally not permitted to be held within the city limits, but were relegated to suburban areas like the mountains, the beach, or the rooftop of houses where women could disport themselves without contaminating the ears or civic space of men. To be exposed to such sound is for Alcaios a condition of political nakedness as alarming as that of his archetype Odysseus, who awakens with no clothes on a thicket on the island of Phaeacia in the sixth book of Homer's Odyssey, surrounded by the shrieking of women. What a hullabaloo of female comes around me, Odysseus exclaims, and goes on to wonder what sort of savages or supernatural beings can be making such a racket. The savages, of course, turn out to be Nausicaa and her girlfriends playing soccer on the riverbank. But what is interesting in this scenario is Odysseus' automatic association of disorderly female sound with wild space, with savagery and the supernatural. Nausicaa and her friends are surely compared by Homer to the wild gales who roam the mountains in attendance upon Artemis, a goddess herself notorious for the sounds that she makes, if we may judge from her Homeric epithetes. Artemis is called Keladeine, derived from the noun kelados, which means a loud roaring noise as of wind or rushing water or the tumult of battle. Artemis is also called Ioheaira, which is usually etymologized to mean she who pours forth arrows, from Ios meaning arrow, but could just as well come from the exclamatory sound Io and mean, quote, she who pours forth the cry Io, end quote. Greek women of the archaic and classical periods were not encouraged to pour forth unregulated cries of any kind within the civic space of the polis or within earshot of men. Indeed, masculinity in such a culture defines itself by its different use of sound. Verbal continence is an essential feature of the masculine virtue sophrosine, prudence, soundness of mind, moderation, temperance, self control. that organizes most patriarchal thinking on ethical or emotional matters. Woman as a species is frequently said to lack the ordering principle of Sophrosine. Freud formulates the double standard succinctly in a remark to a colleague. Quote, a thinking man is his own legislator and confessor, and obtains his own absolution, but the woman does not have the measure of ethics in herself. She can only act if she keeps within the limits of morality, following what society has established as fitting. End quote. So too, ancient discussions of the virtue of Sophrosne demonstrate clearly that where it is applied, so woman, this word has a different definition than for men. Female Sophrosine is coextensive with female obedience to make direction and rarely means more than chastity. When it does mean more, the allusion is often to sound. A husband exhorting his wife or concubine to Sophrosine is likely to mean be quiet. The Pythagorean heroine Timiche, who bit off her tongue rather than say the wrong thing, is praised as an exception to the female rule. In general, the women of classical literature are species given to disorderly and uncontrolled outflow of sound, to shrieking, wailing, sobbing, shrill lament, laughter, screams of pain or of pleasure, and eruptions of raw emotion in general. As Euripides put it, quote, for it is woman's inborn pleasure always to have her current emotions coming up to her mouth and out through her tongue, end quote, Andromache. When a man lets his current emotion come up to his mouth and out through his tongue, he is thereby feminized, as Heracles at the end of the Trachimene agonizes to find himself, quote, sobbing like a girl, whereas before I used to follow my difficult course without a groan, but now in pain I am discovered a woman, end quote.
Frederick Lorden, The Girlfriend Experience. The Girlfriend Experience After the Gift of Tears. The distinction between the successful endeavor of reconfiguring the desire of employees and the pure and simple enslavement of reconditioning is at times extremely tenuous. Winifred Poster reports on the outstanding example of Indian workers in the outsourced call center of a US service company, whose employer does not hesitate to compel them to take on a borrowed American identity in order to better relate to clients. Not only must the call center employees speak English with an American accent and diction, but they also have to develop an interest in regional news, notably sport and the weather, from the part of the US they cover, so as to chat with their customers. They were also advised to watch Friends. And finally, they must change their names. An Anil becomes an Arnold. Examples of this kind give a fairly clear idea of the neoliberal utopia of the full makeover of individuals. Their extreme character should not obscure the general tendencies of the economic shift towards the service sector, where the productive performance is primarily a human performance, namely affective and behavioral. Pushing to the utmost the reification already inscribed in the vocabulary of economists, labor factor, and shareholders, human resources, the master desire of capital no longer makes a secret of the fact that it sees employees as endlessly malleable material, capable of being reshaped to any model that suits its requisites, thus revealing in this image the ultimate truth of the employment relation as a relation of instrumentalization, a reductio ad utensilium. One must in fact go very far in denying individuals any inner consistency. At this stage, no one dares even to mention grand terms such as dignity, in order to find projects of identity remanufacturing of comparable scope. But there is actually worse than the outsourced Indian call center, in which, after all, employees still have some room to resist the colonization of their personhood by keeping the behavioral script at a distance as a role to enact, which allows them to recover the integrity of their persons once the performance is over. There is worse indeed every time an enterprise in the service sector not only commands employees to show the required emotions, empathy, attention, solicitude, smiling, but aims at the ultimate behavioral performance in which the prescribed emotions are no longer merely outwardly enacted, but authentically felt. This, in fact, closely resembles the practice of the 17th century church, which, in giving its absolution, no longer settled for contrition, the ritualized outward expression of words always suspected of hiding insincerity, but demanded attrition, the presence in the confessed of an authentic love of God from which the words must flow, namely an internal disposition. With this, in keeping with its historical dynamics and with the global or universal propagation of the faith that gave it its name, Catholicos, the Church was merely extending to the mass of believers practices previously reserved for the virtuous or the elect, such as the gift of tears, understood as the external sign of an effective interiority authentically inhabited by grace. Through a leap in time, that is in fact a continuous expansion, neoliberal capitalism inherits this long historical labor and adds its own extensions by putting, so to speak, the gift of tears on the agenda of the whole class of employees. But this deliberate attempt to generalize virtuosity encounters a number of difficulties. Since the sincerity of first-person experience is perceived as a guarantee of authenticity, hence of the emotional quality of the provided service, companies do not hesitate to throw their employees into the inevitable double bind that consists in attempting to manufacture artlessness. On command, the smile must be true, coming from the bottom of the heart, and the human material, a term that should definitely be preferred to that of human resources, which still falls short of the truth, must contend as it can with these contradictions of spontaneity on command and naturalness on demand. But the Christian idea of the gift of tears no longer resonates with the contemporaries, who are looking for other references and will find them. It is a safe bet that if one day, following a change in custom or regulations, prostitution leaves the underworld and become an official trade, any company entering that market will expect its employees to kiss and then to love for real. Neoliberal capital is the world of the girlfriend experience.
Jacques Lacan, Encore, Seminar 20. We can't get rid of that renowned extended substance, the complement of that other substance, that easily either, since it is modern space. The substance of pure space, like we say pure spirit. It certainly isn't very promising. Pure space is based on the notion of the part, as long as one adds to that the following, that all of the parts are external to each other, partes extra partes. People managed to extract a few little things from even that, but some serious steps had to be taken. In order to situate my signifier before leaving you today, I will ask you to consider what was inscribed at the beginning of my first sentence last time. Enjoying a body that symbolizes the other, as it perhaps involves something that can help us focus on another form of substance, enjoying substance. Isn't that precisely what psychoanalytic experience presupposes? The substance of the body, on the condition that it is defined only as that which enjoys itself. That is, no doubt, a property of the living body, but we don't know what it means to be alive except for the following fact, that a body is something that enjoys itself. It enjoys itself only by corporizing the body in a signifying way. That implies something other than the partes extra partes of extended substance. As is emphasized admirably by the kind of Kantian that Sade was, one can only enjoy a part of the other's body, for the simple reason that one has never seen a body completely wrap itself around the other's body to the point of surrounding and phagocytizing it. That is why we must confine ourselves to simply giving it a little squeeze, like that, taking a forearm or anything else. Ouch! Enjoying has the fundamental property that it is, ultimately, one person's body that enjoys a part of the other's body. but that part also enjoys. The other likes it more or less, but it is a fact that the other cannot remain indifferent to it. Occasionally, something even happens that goes beyond what I just described, and that is marked by utter signifying ambiguity. For the expression enjoyment of the body includes a genitive that has a certain Sadian flavor to it, as I've mentioned, or, on the contrary, an ecstatic subjective flavor, suggesting, in fact, that it is the other who enjoys. As concerns jouissance, that is but an elementary level. The last time I put forward the notion that jouissance is not a sign of love. That is what I shall have to argue for, and it will lead us to the level of phallic jouissance. But what I, strictly speaking, call jouissance of the other, insofar as it is merely symbolized here, is something else altogether, namely the knothole that I will have to articulate. In this single articulation, what is the signifier? The signifier for today, and to close on this point, given the motives I have regarding it. I will say that the signifier is situated at the level of enjoying substance. That is completely different from Aristotelian physics, which I am about to discuss, and which, precisely because it can be used in the way I am going to use it, shows us to what extent it was illusory. The signifier is the cause of jouissance. Without the signifier, how could we even approach that part of the body? Without the signifier, how could we center that something that is the material cause of jouissance? However fuzzy or confused it may be, it is a part of the body that is signified in this contribution. Now I will go right to the final cause, final in every sense of the term because it is the terminus. The signifier is what brings jouissance to a halt. After those who embrace, if you'll allow me, alas! And after those who are weary, hold on there. The other pole of the signifier, its stopping action, is as much there at the origin as the commandment's direct addressing can be. The efficient, which Aristotle proposes as the third form of the cause, is nothing in the end but the project through which jouissance is limited. All kinds of things that appear in the animal kingdom make a parody of speaking beings' path to jouissance, while simultaneously sketching out message-like functions. For example, the bee transporting the pollen of the male flower to the female flower closely resembles what goes on in communication. And the embrace, the confused embrace wherein jouissance finds its cause, its last cause, which is formal. Isn't it something like grammar that commands it? It's no accident that Pierre beats Paul at the crux of the first examples of French grammar, nor that, why not put it this way, Pierre and Paul constitute the example of conjunction, except that one must wonder afterwards who shoves the other. I've already gotten a lot of mileage out of that one. One could even say that the verb is defined as a signifier that is not as stupid. You have to write that as one word, not as stupid as the others. No doubt, providing as it does the movement of a subject to his own division in jouissance. And it is all the less stupid when the verb determines this division as disjunction, and it becomes a sign. Last year, I played on a slip of the pen I made in a letter addressed to a woman. You will never know how much I loved you. Acute E instead of acute E. Since then, someone mentioned to me that that could mean that I am a homosexual. But what I articulated quite precisely last year is that when one loves, it has nothing to do with sex. That is what I would like to end with today, if you will.
Paul B. Preciado, Pornotopia. Striptease as a journalistic technique becomes even more explicit when, 2 years after the publication of his first comic, Hefner sold an article entitled How a Cartoonist Lives to the Chicago Daily News. Published on March 21, 1953, the story portrays, through interviews and photographs, the private life of an anonymous couple in the interior of a Chicago apartment. However, it wasn't just any story. The newlyweds were the Hefners, Hugh and Millie along with their baby Christine. And the apartment was their own home on 6052 South Harper on the south side. Using self-fictional writing and representation, Hefner turned theatrical, media, and surveillance devices to his own interior, rendering his domestic space visible. Displacing the striptease technique of publication of the private towards his own life, Hefner began, even before the publication of Playboy, a domestic, self-exhibiting process that prefigures the later spectacularization of the bachelor pad and the Playboy mansion, and that anticipates the consumption of intimacy that would later characterize the end of the 20th century with the arrival of the reality show and Jenny Cam. The article consisted of a story about, quote, urban modern life, and 5 photographs of the apartment where Hefner himself, his wife, and his daughter posed for the camera. The Hefner's house, decorated by Hugh himself, is represented as an example of, quote, modern living, full of, quote, simple and functional designs. Among them, an orange womb chair designed by Hans Knoll and Herman Miller, fiberglass chairs, and a television in the living room. According to the Chicago Daily News, this impression of modernity was accompanied by examples of visual advancement in art and science, with a reproduction of a Picasso painting and a pair of X-rays showing Hugh and Millie's abdomens hanging on the walls. A few months later, Hefner would end up pawning these same pieces of furniture for $600 to be able to pay for Playboy's first issue. Quote, modern living, the article explained, is a favorite subject in Hugh Hefner cartoons. He pokes fun at their stark simplicity and functionalism, but the apartment he and wife Millie call home is simple, modern, and functional. They were thrilled when they found an old apartment in a building at 6052 South Harper. It needed a lot of work before it suited them, but one look at it now compensates them for their labor. The landlord removed the old paper and had major replastering done. Then the Hefners went to work, spackling, cleaning, painting, varnishing, and papering. The end result is an apartment chock full of originality and personal touches, end quote. The master bedroom, quote, is simply furnished with yet low walls contrasting dark green bamboo shades, end quote. In the dining room, the, quote, walnut dining set is by Herman Miller. Record cabinet was built at home by Hefner, end quote. While elsewhere, quote, cartoons are used in Christine's room. One wall is papered in strips from Pogo, which appeared in the Daily News, end quote. However, what fixes our attention on these images, beyond the few pieces of furniture, is the way in which the Hefners have turned the private life of the American heterosexual white family into theater. In this modern scenario, Hugh and Millie occupy positions that are as scrutinized as their furniture. However, the traditional gendered codes of representation in the suburban house during the post-war era have been subtly inverted. In the living room, while Millie appears on the couch reading the newspaper, an activity typically coded as masculine, Hefner seats on the floor, positioning himself in the photograph at an inferior level to his wife, and with the baby on his knees. More than a feminization of the masculine position, we could say that Hefner avoids the classical 1950s masculine emplacement to locate himself in the site of infancy, a space before verticality, rejecting the superior level of adulthood as well as the gender norms which govern within it. Prefiguring the photographic reportage and the television show that would later be set in the Playboy Mansion, Hefner exposes and makes the interior of his own apartment visible by a theatrical construction of a domestic self-fiction. What we are shown is a striptease of American heterosexual domestic life. Nevertheless, this is not an unveiling of a hidden truth, but rather a theatrical production and a narrative construction process in which each detail has been technically orchestrated. In fact, the article produced a fiction that had little to do with reality. By that time, the Hefners had already decided to divorce, and Hefner had began sexual experimentation at the swingers' parties, although they decided to, quote, play the part of the perfect couple, as Millie would later explain. This spectacle of interiority is the first instance of what would later become Playboy's representation strategy par excellence, the production of a theatricalized and public self-fiction of domesticity. The most striking aspect of this story is the display of what we would call, quote, architectonic self-fiction, a visual narrative where autobiography is produced through the representation of interior design. There are no psychological details in the article, which would allow one to delve in the character's intimacy. The main hypothesis working behind this first photo article, which would later gain strength within Playboy, is that modern subjectivity cannot be accessed through a psychological narrative, but rather must be constructed through architectonic representation. The question, quote, how does a cartoonist live, is answered by exhibiting his domestic interior space. If we take into account that domesticity has been historically defined after the appearance of the bourgeois interior space in the 19th century, as opposed to public space and publicity, we could then say that the operation initiated tactically with this article in the Chicago Daily News, and would later unfold in its whole vastness in Playboy, is a de-domestication process of the bourgeois interior, its very production as media exhibit, a condition that will come to characterize a new undomestic domesticity. This is not just a process of showing a domesticity that already exists, but rather a production of a fiction of domesticity through media representation, or rather, the de-domestication of the 19th century disciplinary domesticity. In Playboy, this mutating domesticity will take the form of a pornotopia, a theatrical and multimedia interior produced and reproduced through media surveillance and pornographic techniques. A process of reconstruction of traditional limits between privacy and publicity, similar to the one Hefner set through the self-display exercises of the domestic, was taking place in some of the best-known architectural projects of the 1950s. While Mies van der Rohe and Philip Johnson eliminated the internal divisions and used the crystal walls to uncover domesticity, another way of undressing architecture, Hefner insists in representing domesticity as in media, first with photography and writing, and later on through television, cinema, video, and even video games. What is being revealed is architecture's theatrical and political character, the cultural conditions separating the visible from the invisible, which had funded the private and the public regimes since the 19th century and up to the Cold War. This unveiling of domesticity taking place in Mies van der Rohe and Johnson, as well as in Playboy, will result on the production of a, quote, post-domestic interior that no longer is characterized by its privacy and in which the inhabitants are conscious of their double theatrical condition, serving at the same time as actors and spectators.
Homer, the Odyssey. And with those words, the goddess quickly turned and led the way. He followed in her footsteps. They reached the cave together, man and goddess. The chair that Hermes had been sitting on was empty now. Odysseus sat there. The goddess gave him human food and drink. She sat and faced godlike Odysseus, while slave girls brought her nectar and ambrosia. They reached to take the good things set before them and satisfy their hunger and their thirst. The goddess queen began, Odysseus, son of Laertes, blessed by Zeus, your plans are always changing. Do you really want to go back to that home you love so much? Well then, goodbye. But if you understand how glutted you will be with suffering before we reach your home, you would stay here with me and be immortal, though you might still wish to see that wife you always pine for. And anyway, I know my body is better than hers. I am taller too. Mortals can never rival the immortals in beauty. So Odysseus, with tact, said, do not be enraged at me, great goddess. You are quite right. I know my mother's wife Penelope could never match your beauty. She is a human. You are deathless, ageless. But even so, I want to go back home. And every day I hope the day will come. If some god strikes me on the wine dark sea, I will endure it. By now I'm used to suffering. I have gone through so much at sea and in the war. Let this come too. The sun went down and brought the darkness on. They went inside the hollow cave and took the pleasure of their love, held close together.
Barbara Cassin, Nostalgia, When Are We Ever at Home? A few words are in order here to give some sense of the pagan world that Homer has us enter. As Nietzsche says, quote, it makes a difference whether Homer or the Bible or science tyrannizes human beings. End of quote. Here is the criterion I would suggest to define the pagan world. It is a world in which the one who arrives before you might always be a god, for that is what a pagan expects when he meets a human being. He or she may be divine. In a monotheistic world that could not happen, even if the Messiah has already come. In Homer's world, on the contrary, everything is permeable: men, gods, animals, things. Odysseus is the divine Odysseus, as naturally as he is Polytropos, of 1,000 ruses. The Homeric epithets are said to be nature epithets. They bespeak the nature, the very being, of what they designate. And when he appears before Nausicaa, he is like some hill-capped lion. As for Nausicaa, Odysseus addresses her, whether she be mortal or goddess, and he likens her in her incomparable beauty to the stalk of a young palm. Cosmos, order and beauty, is thus the word to describe this dreamlike harmony of the world, perceptible in the always Greek reality of an island. It is not a question, then, of whether the transcendent God exists or not, either as a demiurge or a mathematician. The gods are rather the oniric lining immanent to the world. These brilliant Olympians, born of a dream, are for the Greeks the sphere of beauty in which they saw their mirror images, says Nietzsche, who suggests characterizing the dreaming Greeks as Homer's and Homer as a dreaming Greek. Such is the world the Odyssey makes us enter. We will see that it is not quite Virgil's world. Between the divine Odysseus and the pious Aeneas is not the same way of being pagan. The one is natural, the other political. In front of the assembled gods, Athena complains that Odysseus, whom she protects, is the only one who has not returned home. He who would like to see the smoke rise from his land, cries out from afar and calls for death. It has been 7 years that Calypso, the one who keeps in hiding, the one who covers over, has kept Odysseus from his island and poured sweet loving words upon him so that he might forget Ithaca. The nymph is Poseidon's daughter, the god of the sea, whom Odysseus offended by killing the Cyclops, and who persists in refusing him his day of return. But Poseidon is far away, gone to the Ethiopians, and Athena proposes to take advantage of his absence. Bryce says, quote, "For so it is fated that he shall see his people and come back to his house." End of quote. He thus sends Hermes to Calypso. The nymph with flowing hair responds that she will obey his decree without protest, though she complains that the jealous gods are, quote, "resentful towards the goddesses for sleeping openly with such men as each has made her true husband." End of quote. Love and love rivalries, the relationship between the new and the old, the way the new becomes old and the novel habit. In short, time as linear and cyclical, that is one of the keys to nostalgia. Here is the central scene that describes homesickness. Calypso, obedient, goes to Odysseus. Quote, "She found him sitting on the seashore, and his eyes were never wiped dry of tears, and the sweet lifetime was draining out of him. Kataibeto glucus aion, as he wept for a way home, since the nymph was no longer pleasing to him. By nights he would lie beside her, of necessity, in the hollow caverns, in tears and lamentation and sorrow, as he looked out over the barren water." End of quote. We have here the very image of nostalgia à la Caspar David Friedrich. Odysseus, on his promontory, seen from behind, looking out to the sea, his sweet Aion flowing out of him, the flow of his tears thus dissipating in the sap and time of his life, for Aion says all of this at once. Calypso, who is in love with him and is going to help him, warns him one last time, quote, "I wish you well, however you do it. But if you only knew in your own heart how many hardships you were fated to undergo before getting back to your country, you would stay here with me and be the lord of this household and be immortal." End of quote. Nostalgia is what makes one prefer going home, even if it means finding there a time that passes by, death, and worse, old age, rather than immortality. Such is the weight of the desire to return. Odysseus responds to her, quote, Goddess and Queen, do not be angry with me. I myself know that all you say is true and that circumspect Penelope can never match the impression you make for beauty and stature. She is mortal, after all, and you are immortal and ageless. But even so, what I want and all my days I pine for is to go back to my house and see my day of homecoming. End of quote. Kant claimed that those suffering from nostalgia, the Swiss included, are always disappointed because it is not the place of their youth that they seek, but their youth itself. They find their anticipation dampened, and thus, he adds, their homesickness cured. Odysseus gives proof rather to the contrary. It is Penelope he wants, even with her age. Not eternal youth, but the time that passes. It is true, nostalgia connects space and time. But it chooses the mortal condition and anchors this condition in a place. Love elsewhere, the love of elsewhere, yields before the desire for the same. Rather than the sovereign beauty of Calypso, rather than eternity, nostalgia chooses finitude and oikade, home. To return home is to submit to a common fate, aging, dying, living with one's kin for the rest of one's life, says Dupillet. And when Odysseus leaves for a second time, it is still the return that makes him sigh. Recognition. But how do you know you're back home?
Fuzz Box, The At War Issue, Volume 2, Number 5, Fall 1991, edited by Nicholas Jenkins. July 15th, 1990, 4 a.m. Police raid Sex Garage, a queer private party. Arrest 8, brutalize many more. One man hospitalized with head injuries. July 15th, 1990, 9 p.m. 400 queers stopped downtown traffic for 2 hours to protest police brutality and homophobia. No arrests are made. July 16th, 1990, 2 p.m. 200 queers stage sit-in on street in front of police station. Cops wearing riot gear and latex gloves beat protesters, arresting 48. Many beaten inside police station. One man hospitalized. July 29th, 1990, 1 p.m. 2,000 queers march and rally to protest police attacks. Strongest unity and visibility of Montreal dykes and fags in years. July 29th, 1990, 11 p.m. Sex Garage benefit held at gay club raises $5,000 for legal fees of 56 arrested. Spring 1991. 8 arrested morning of July 15th, 1990 at Sex Garage party go to court individually. 6 plead guilty, receive light fines. 7th found guilty, given heavier sentence. 8th case still pending. July 28th, 1991. March and rally held to commemorate events of previous summer in solidarity with the Black community, current and past victims of bigoted cops. Hopefully the beginnings of a less than tired Gay Pride Day. Summer 1991. Man beaten in police station after arrest at sit-in, July 16, 1990, launches 40,000 suit against the city. Autumn 1991. 48 arrested July 15, 1990 at sit-in to go to trial.
José Carlos Mariátegui, The National and the Exotic. Frequently, one hears voices warning against the assimilation of foreign ideas. These voices denounce the danger of an ideology inadequate to national reality spreading in the country. And they are not a protest arising from the superstitions and prejudices of the defamed, uneducated masses. In many cases, these voices come from the intellectual stratum. They could betray a mere protectionist tendency, directed at defending the products of the national intelligentsia against foreign competition. But the enemies of exotic ideology only reject imports that are contrary to conservative interests. The imports that are useful to those interests never seem bad to them, regardless of their origin. What it is really about, then, is a simple reactionary attitude disguised as nationalism. The thesis in question leans on some fragile commonplaces. More than a thesis, it is a dogma. Its supporters demonstrate very little imagination, in truth. What is more, they demonstrate a very meager understanding of national reality. They want to legislate for Peru, to think and write for Peruvians, and to nationally resolve the problems of Peruvianness, desires which they imagine to be threatened by leaks of European thought. But all of these affirmations are too vague and generic. They do not demarcate the limit of the national and the exotic. They abstractly invoke a Peruvianness that they do not attempt to define beforehand. That Peruvianness, profusely insinuated, is a myth, is a fiction. National reality is less disconnected, less independent from Europe than our nationalists suppose. Contemporary Peru moves within the orbit of Western civilization. Mystified national reality is nothing but a segment, a partition of the vast world reality. Everything that contemporary Peru values, it has received from that civilization, which I'm not sure if the staunch nationalists would also consider exotic. Is there today a science, a philosophy, a democracy, an art? Are there machines, institutions, laws that are genuinely and characteristically Peruvian? Perhaps the language that we speak and write, the very language, is a product of the Peruvian people? Peru is still a nationality in formation. The torrents of Western civilization are constructing it on top of inert indigenous strata. The Spanish conquest annihilated Inca culture. It destroyed autochthonous Peru. It frustrated the only Peruvianness that has existed. The Spanish extirpated from the soil and from the race all the living elements of indigenous culture. They replaced Inca religion with the Roman Catholic religion. They left nothing but dead remains of Inca culture. The descendants of the conquistadors and colonizers built the foundations of present-day Peru. Independence was realized by the Creole population. The idea of liberty did not sprout spontaneously from our soil. Its seed came to us from outside. A European event, the French Revolution, engendered American independence. The roots of the liberatory achievement were nourished by the ideology of the rights of man and of the citizen. A historical artifice classifies Tupac Amaru as a precursor to Peruvian independence. Indigenous people made the revolution of Tupac Amaru. The Creoles made the revolution of independence. Between the two events, there was neither spiritual nor ideological kinship. On the other hand, we owe to Europe not only the doctrine of our revolution, but also the possibility of enacting it. Burned and shaken, Spain could not, first of all, validly oppose the freedom of its colonies. Later, it could not attempt their reconquest. The United States declared its solidarity with the liberty of Spanish America. In short, foreign events continued influencing the destinies of Hispanic Americans. Before and after the Emancipatory Revolution, there was no lack of people who believed that Peru was unprepared for independence. Without a doubt, they found liberty and democracy exotic. But history does not prove those negative and skeptical people right, but rather the affirmative, romantic, heroic people who thought that all peoples who know how to acquire freedom are suited to it. Independence accelerated the assimilation of European culture. The development of the country has depended directly on this process of assimilation. Industrialism, mechanization, all the material resources of progress have come to us from outside. We have taken from Europe and the United States all that we could. When our contact abroad has been weakened, national life has slumped. In this way, Peru has remained inserted in the organism of Western civilization. A quick excursion through Peruvian history reveals to us all the foreign elements that mix and combine in our national formation. Contrasting them, identifying them, it is not possible to insist on arbitrary assertions about Peruvianness. It is not possible to speak of national political ideas. We have the duty to not ignore national reality, but we also have the duty to not ignore world reality. Peru is a fragment of a world that continues on a trajectory of solidarity. The peoples with the greatest aptitude for progress are always those with the greatest aptitude to accept the consequences of their civilization and their age. What would one think of a man who, in the name of Peruvianness, rejected the aeroplane, radium, the linotype, considering them exotic? The same should be thought of the man who assumes such an attitude before new ideas and new human incidents. In spite of the millenary roots of their institutions, the old Oriental peoples do not close themselves off, do not isolate themselves. They do not feel themselves to be independent from European history. Turkey, for example, has not sought its renovation in its Islamic traditions, but rather in the currents of Western ideology. Mustafa Kemal has attacked traditions. He has dismissed the caliph and his women from Turkey. He has created a republic of the European type. This revolutionary and iconoclastic orientation naturally does not mark a period of decadence, but rather a period of national rebirth. The new Turkey, the heretical Turkey of Kemal, has discovered how to win the respect of Europe with arms and spirit. On the other hand, the Orthodox Turkey, the traditionalist Turkey of the Sultans, suffered, almost without protest, all the taunts and spoliations of the West. Presently, Turkey repudiates neither the theory nor the technology of Europe, but it repels the attacks of Europeans against its liberty. Its tendency to westernize itself is not a capitulation of its nationalism. This is how old nations possessing their own physiognomic, political, social, and religious forms behave. Therefore, how could Peru, which has still not completed its process of national formation, isolate itself from European ideas and feelings? A people with the will for renovation and growth cannot close itself off. By force, the international relations of the intelligentsia must be free trade. No idea that bears fruit, no idea that acclimates, is an exotic idea. The propagation of an idea is neither the fault nor the merit of its proponents. It is the fault or merit of history. It is not romantic to expect to adapt Peru to a new reality. It is more romantic to deny that reality, accusing it of concomitance with foreign reality. An illustrious sociologist once said that an atmosphere of ideas is lacking in these South American nations. It would be senseless to further rarefy that atmosphere with the persecution of ideas that are currently fertilizing human history. And if, mystically, in a Gandhian way, we desire to separate ourselves and unlink ourselves from satanic European civilization, as Gandhi calls it, we ought to close our borders not only to its theories, but also to its machines, to return to Inca customs and rites. Surely no Creole nationalist would accept this extreme consequence of their jingoism, because here nationalism does not sprout from the soil, does not sprout from the race. Staunch nationalism is the only effectively exotic and alien idea advocated here, and, as alien and exotic, it has very little chance of spreading in the national conglomeration.
Thomas Mullany, the Chinese typewriter. Chinese typewriters were used elsewhere to reproduce entire books, known as Daonben, or typed in mimeographed editions, a mode of publication so prevalent that the term was later repurposed in the computer age as the Chinese translation of to print out, Daiyan, and laser printer, Zhiguang Daiyanji. In one type and mimeograph edition from 1968, a self-identified red guard typed and mimeographed the poetry of Chairman Mao, releasing the edition in time for International Workers' Day. In an even more profound act of devotion, members of the Yunnan University Mao Zedongism Artillery Regiment Foreign Language Division Propaganda Group transcribed Mao's speeches delivered during the years 1957 and 1958, copied from the People's Daily, the China Youth Daily, the New China Bi-Monthly, the Henan Daily, and others. Extending to over 280,000 characters in length, with page after page of densely packed typewritten text, this work would have taken between 100 and 200 hours, or 4 to 8 full days, to type and mimeograph. Occupying the vast terrain between handwriting and the printing press, type and mimeograph editions continued into the Reform era. 1978 to 1989. The nationally circulated Reform-era literary journal Today, described by Lian Su Ming as, quote, the first unofficial journal in China since 1949, end quote, was composed using a Chinese typewriter and mimeograph stencils. The most fascinating dimension of Chinese typewriting in the second half of the 20th century was not its prevalence or scope, however. Within this bustling world of typist activity, something else genuinely revolutionary was unfolding. Everyday clerks and secretaries in the Mao era spearheaded a series of innovations, centered around experiments with alternate ways of organizing the Chinese characters on their tray beds. Instead of adhering to radical stroke organization, or indeed any of the experimental character retrieval systems designed by Chinese elites, as examined in the preceding chapter, these typists undertook a, quote, radical departure in both a figurative and literal sense. Specifically, they created their own idiosyncratic natural language arrangements of Chinese characters designed to maximize the adjacency of characters that tended to appear together in actually written language, whether in the form of commonly used two-character compounds, known in Chinese as qi, or in key names and phrases within communist nomenclature, such as revolution, Geming, socialism, Shehui Zhu Yi, politics, Zhengzhi, and others. Owing to the increased proximity of co-occurring characters and the repetitiveness of communist rhetoric, typists who used this experimental method boasted speeds of up to 70 characters per minute, or at least 3 times faster than the average typing speed in the Republican period. In other words, among Mao-era typists, we can trace the earliest known experimentation with and implementation of an information technology currently referred to as, quote, predictive text, now a common feature in Chinese search and input methods. Indeed, if input methods, shurufa, have been one of the pillars of modern Chinese information technology, as we examined in the preceding chapter, the second pillar is undoubtedly that of predictive text. It may come as a surprise that a technology so familiar to denizens of the digital age has deeply analog roots. Chinese predictive text was invented, popularized, and refined in the context of mechanical Chinese typewriting before the advent of computing. What is more, this innovation cannot be ascribed to a single inventor, but rather came into being through a diffuse collective made up of largely anonymous typists. In November 1956, a typist in the central Chinese city of Luoyang accomplished an astonishing feat. Using a mechanical Chinese typewriter, the very same we have come to know well over the course of this book, the operator typed 4,730 characters in 1 hour, setting a new record just shy of 80 characters per minute. While seemingly unremarkable when considered within the more familiar context of alphabetic typewriting, the magnitude of the record becomes apparent when one considers the average speed of Chinese typists at the time, 20 to 30 characters per minute. This accomplishment thus represented a 2 to 4-fold acceleration of the apparatus. The typist had not achieved this record by means of electrical automation, moreover, or a new kind of typewriter. Instead, he had simply rearranged the Chinese characters on the machine's tray bed. Moving away from the long-standing taxonomic system of radical stroke organization, and eschewing even the most experimental of character retrieval systems developed in the Republican period, the typist in 1956 reorganized the characters on the machine into natural language clusters, designed to maximize the adjacency and proximity of those characters in the Chinese language that tended to go together in actual writing. Newspapers in the opening decade of the People's Republic of China, 1949 to present, were replete with stories of, quote, model workers, proletarian champions who displayed feats of unprecedented production through the combined application of will and wisdom. While such exuberant claims cannot be accepted uncritically, in the case of the, quote, model typist from Luoyang, a diverse body of archival sources and material artifacts has led me to trust the accuracy and perhaps even the quantitative claims of this remarkable report.
José Esteban Muñoz, Cruising Utopia. I use the term communism to help us think a certain communing of incommensurable singularities that can be enacted through an even impersonal sex. But I also mean just plain communism. But let me be more exact. By, quote, just plain communism, end quote, I do not mean to invoke the communism of a mythical society of equals, but instead, the communism of living within a sense of commons, a living in common. Michael Hart describes this idea of the common in communism as, quote, the affirmation of open, autonomous biopolitical production, the self governed continuous creation of humanity, end quote. In the work of Nancy, we encounter a communism that is most immediately summarized as a being singular plural. Nancy explains that communism, quote, means the common condition of all the singularities of subjects, that is, of all the exceptions, all the uncommon points whose network makes a world, a possibility of sense, end quote. He goes on to suggest that this notion of communism does not belong solely to the political, but precedes it. It is important to emphasize that, quote, not belonging, end quote, to politics in Nancy's sense is not an escape or refusal of the political. It is just the opposite. Here, I return to the auto examination of my book that I began the chapter with how are queer politics possible? When I call for a reinvigoration of the queer political imagination, I am turning to communism, or maybe better put, naming something that I failed to name with enough force in my book. Communism is an idea that is almost as old as utopia. Communism is first and foremost about the precondition for emancipation. But emancipation from what, we might ask? Here we come to understand emancipation as freedom from historical forces that dull or diminish our sense of the world. Nancy points out that Marx himself argued that the commune was the antithesis of empire. Communism could therefore be antithetical to our inner and outer colonialism, those blockages that disallow our arrival at an actual sense of the world, which is the world as a plurality of senses. This sense can be impersonal or even structured around the figuration of the humanization and submission that Fisher longed for. Indeed, as Sedgwick has pointed out, so much can be, quote, splayed through the crystal of anonymity, end quote, and include impulses that can be equally tender and destructive, and indeed they are simultaneously both. I am interested in thinking about both Fisher and Fisher with Sedgwick as offerings as the option to think beyond the register of the individual subject. Implicit in this line of argumentation is the idea that ideologies that enable empire are shored up by a reification of the individual sovereign subject who can think of itself as differentiated from a larger sense of the commons. Thinking of the self as purely singular enables a mode of imagining the self as not imbricated in a larger secret of belonging, what I call an actual sense of the world where we grasp the plurality of the senses, which is not one's own senses, but instead the multiple senses of multiple singularities. Such a logic of the singular that eschews plurality is able to self authorize oneself to dispossess those outside any particular logic of the singular. Sedgwick and Fisher perform and map a relational schema that is not based on commensurable singularities, but instead on a vaster commons of the incommensurable. Thinking about incommensurability is not means to cleanse or make Fisher's sex, desire, or writing antiseptic. The crisscrossing trajectories of the singular being are certainly full of violent collision, especially when we think about the history of dispossessed people, and we must not fail to understand these crashes as being traumatic or violent. I don't want to simply suggest that the incommensurable is the ludic mode where desire and ethics can be easily worked out. Indeed, the incommensurable can lead to annihilating violence, like that which, in the last 2 years, took the lives of Lyndon Barrett, a talented theorist of race and value who was killed by a man the police describe as an acquaintance, and the writer Don Belton, who wrote a beautiful introduction to Carry in Your Pocket. Don was murdered by a young man who, when tried for the murder, used a sexual panic defense, not unlike those analyzed and described by Sedgwick in Between Men, 1985. Yet, without denying the implicit and explicit violence of certain scenes and acts, we can nevertheless see something else in Fisher's insistence on the incommensurable over-equivalence, which may be a certain kind of freedom. In this instance, we can revisit Sedgwick's sentence one last time. Quote, probably any sexuality is a matter of sorting, displacing, singleness or plurality, literality or figurativeness to a very limited number of sites and signifiers, end quote. Sex and sexuality in this passage are, quote, a matter of sorting, displacing, reassigning singleness or plurality, end quote. And it is this somewhat structural account of the structurelessness of sex that resonates with the larger ontological mapping of a world that exceeds equivalence. Nansiri remarks that it was Marx who best understood that man produces himself, and that his production is worth infinitely more than any measurable evaluation.
Queers at War. Zing! Blap! Fighting queer bashers. Resisting the pleasure police. Photos by Peter Colley and Pierre Delpay.